Go for Leadership, the podcast with Daniel and Gert.
Hello and welcome for the Go for Leadership podcast series. My guest today is Anselm Zebner.
Go for Leadership interviews.
Anselm, welcome to the show.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me here. And I'm curious about our interview.
Awesome. Well, I always ask or start with the question, how would you define leadership? And so the question goes to you, Anselm. How would you define leadership, or what does leadership mean to you?
So there's an intuitive answer to that and no answer from the book. But the first answer to that is something that we all think is a good leadership from the heart, if we feel it like this. So at the end, what we expect from a leader, or I expect, is to be a role model in some kind, be inspirational and have values in some kind, also challenge the people, and to make a summary for that, to develop the individuals, the team, and the company.
I think that there's a quite broad definition, and I like that. So in particular, in the times where many people are, let's say, irritated with the pandemic and also maybe having, let's say, challenges at home, how can you derive inspirational leadership in particular in your situation where you are into a startup situation? So how do you give inspiration to your team to thrive for excellence?
I do it consciously. So we have, as you mentioned, we had this pandemic situation. So we had also this home office challenges, which means, especially in an early stage startup, that a lot of the discussions and the ideation phase is brought in this home office setup with all the uncertainty. So there's uncertainty, and there are the communication barriers you have in a home office, which are, in fact, they are there. So and it's also a trust thing. I see it as a trust thing as well. So these are all the setups, but you can bring inspiration in by bringing some thoughts consciously in the morning meeting, for example, or by having a channel in your Teams or Slack where you bring inspiration in. For me and for us as a founder team, we also have some values, and I repeat that values. So like I want our organization to be a learning organization that also brings its learning to the outside, a sharing and a transparent organization, and a supporting organization. And if we repeat that and make examples for that, that will come through. We didn't do workshops like leadership workshops or culture workshops. We are a small team, and in the beginning you have other topics to discuss about than 2 days culture workshops or stuff like that.
For sure. What comes to my mind is in particular in the early stage phase of a company where you need to, let's say, set the guardrails in order to, let's say, set the company up for success. There's a lot of, I think, learning in particular in that phase. So how do you bridge the physical gap, let's say, between the different home offices? Do we have set up kind of learning sessions, particularly with the team? Because in my experience, of course, the coffee corners are the areas where you share learnings, challenges that you have overcome, how you have overcome them, where you set those, let's say, sessions, or how do you exchange those learnings with your team?
Yes. So we're still working on that part because we are now partly in the office and partly remote. And on the one side, we have a documentation structure, which sometimes we need to remind each other of. So there's the plan that everybody documents at the end of the day, something not in the CRM system, not somewhere, but also in Teams, like what I learned today. But to be honest, on some days people, they have a meeting in the evening and then they don't get it because it was too much work. But we kind of want to have this double structure between meetings and documenting this as well. And the other part as well is that we are working, I think, in a good way with social media, and we want to make this social media conversation happening with our users, with our customers, but also to future employees. So sharing of our startup life is part of our social media strategy. And since we don't have external documentation people, it's part of everybody's work. So if you, for example, doing an internship at our company, the documentation you have to do is at least one LinkedIn post per week.
Awesome.
And this works for the end of the internship when I have to look, okay, how did it work? It's a fact that it's part of the documentation and it's something everybody of us reads as well. Yeah.
I like that. So you have a lot of experience also in the enterprise area. How would you describe the difference between the leadership between a large corporation and now being you as a startup founder?
I think there are differences, and I also want to begin with similarities, because there are a lot of things that I learned from the enterprise sales roles I had. And if you're leading, for example, for a big enterprise, sales teams and bid teams of around 30 people that have to bring an offer of 100 or 200 pages to a customer in several months. You don't, as a salesperson, as an account manager, you are not the direct manager of most of these people. So you don't have the power to say, today we're doing it like this. You have to convince and to motivate through the aim and through what motivates people, the chance we have to win. And this learning without being the direct manager was very important for me as a leader, because in a startup, it's also not like you're the manager and you say, okay, you will work in my company for 20 years. Most people you want to attract in a startup want to personally grow. And for that, it would be okay if they leave the company someday. So I have to do the journey. They join with us very, very good. And this is a big similarity. What I think is different is the imperfection we have to have and the velocity. Because in big corporations, sometimes there's enough time for things. And in startups, in like 2 months ago, we had 2 more persons joining in our company. And in startups, it's most times also that people that join are very young. Mm-hmm. So I have one of my principles is that we do every week add something. So what we did last week will be routine. And next week, there's something new to learn and to bring to the routine. And so the velocity and the learning and being challenged is very important for me. It's not like, okay, here I have a senior consultant, technical for networks, and he does his stuff. He is an independent person. I just need his calculation. Mm-hmm. So we are very much going deeper and being more challenged on this.
I think that's a great method that you just described. So not to learn something, to also apply it, to make it, like you said, a routine. I think that's maybe even also something that large corporation can learn and should learn. That's why we also see a lot of movement from large corporation to, let's say, structure into smaller startups, or to make, let's say, hyper or hybrid, let's say, structures to cooperate with startups. So I think there's, like you said, there's something that maybe you can bring in with your experience from a large corporation, but also vice versa. I think it's worthwhile for a large corporation to listen in and to learn from the challenges that you are facing and how you are facing them. So how would you describe overall your leadership style? I know that you have asked your team to describe or to give feedback. What was first their feedback, and how was it maybe even clashing with the view you had of your own leadership style?
I want to I begin with what we are. I think we work very much in a team, and we work very much with giving responsibility to each of us. This, in fact, begins with interns. The motivation has to come also from the founders, but from what we do. So, and supporting each other is very important. And where does this come from? Looking at what I think of myself as a leader would be, I don't see myself as a better person than them. So, and I don't see myself as a very traditional leader in a kind of, okay, it's all set up with me. So sometimes I say transparent, I don't know if I'm good at it, or please criticize me if this is not a good idea, because in fact, I'm not the expert of everything, and I try to communicate this very transparent. And this, in fact, it works. So even we have challenges and have a lot of work, there's also the fun part, which is important. So I think it's a supportive approach driven by a few values that don't come out of workshops, but that come out of my personal history.
Mm-hmm. When you compare, let's say, your experience as a leader and the learning curve there in comparison now to your current situation, would you say that the learning curve that you are making with yourself and with your team is much steeper, let's say, than in the corporate environment? More intense, let's say, the experience is more intense, right?
Yes, it's intense, and at the end, it's a complete new thing, because building a company, it's part of the journey that you want to do more, that you want to learn more. Even for your team, everybody who joins a startup normally wants to do more things different than being specialized from the first day on. And so it's part of the culture, and as a leader, you have to develop, otherwise you have to go someday. And big corporations or traditional corporations, they are either built around a product or a service or a company history, and it works fine. So sometimes you like to compare, but we work very well, for example, with traditional manufacturing companies, and they have also very strong values, positive values. So it's just different. It's not a bad or a good thing. But in a startup, you have to talk very much within the team, because things change from 1 month to the other, and things are like completely different in 2 months later than 2 months before.
Is there any best practices that you want to share with the audience, in particular in to leaders that are maybe also in the situation that you are?
I think it is very good to be an open person. So to talk about your own weaknesses and your own strengths. And this is possible to do with everybody. And to be, on the one side, transparent, I always say, but also when it comes to supporting. In our team, in fact, I asked the people, where do you want to be in 5 or 10 years? And I know that there are people who say, okay, today in the VUCA world, that's the wrong question, but we have a journey together. But without knowing what people in their deep want to achieve, we cannot define the journey together. And at the end, people recognize that they as a person are supported. And this makes kind of the spirit.
So what my experience is as well, that it's very important to build up, let's say, a teaming much more than in corporate worlds, right? Because in corporate worlds, in many situations, we have teams split all over the place. So you outlined a little bit how you do that. Now, when you come back, let's say in the office, do you think it's much easier to build that, let's say, startup spirit to engage the people much more?
It is. So, and there's no, for me, there's no doubt about it, because there are kinds, like people say, osmotic communications, where you just listen and see what other people do. And you can't summarize what you did in a day in a 10-minute afternoon meeting or a 10-minute morning meeting. And all the coffee talk, you can try to simulate it in remote environments, but it's different when you meet each other. So this is an important part, and I'm very grateful that we already have currently 3 days a week where we meet in the office.
Awesome. If you, let's say, and I think that has been a question I asked many times, how would you say leaders are being prepared at this time? Let's say talking about school, universities, and maybe also in large corporation, but also maybe in startup situation. Because I think there is the need for to become a good leader to have a certain way of preparation for getting into your first, let's say, leadership role. In your point of view, do you think, in particular now as we are both living in Germany, do you think that there's a good preparation, starting, let's say, with kindergarten, school system, universities, or other, let's say, kind of learnings, in order to prepare the people for such also challenging leadership roles that we have these days?
So I don't know about the current school system good enough, because I'm 37. So this was a time ago. But I think being in some clubs in your free time always helps. So either doing sport or being in I was in a church youth organization where you are also challenged from the beginning on, because if you're 13 and you're organizing a summer camp for others with 14 years old, you're not finished in your personal development as well. So it's challenging from that on, and every person has different ways, but if you're kind of this person who speaks up, you will fall into roles from beginning on where you kind of lead somehow. And every role where you don't have a power that is set up by work contracts is a good training for that. And also every role where things have to be explained and being voluntary, because at the end, money is important, but if people work voluntary together, it brings more energy and more fun.
I absolutely agree. Anselm, if you look back and you may give feedback or impulse to the younger Anselm when he started his career, what would be your advice?
That's a good question, but I like very much the approach that if you do things and think about them, there's always a learning. So even from persons who change their career in something completely different, most times they get something out of their first career as well. So doing many things leads to many learnings, and so it's better to be very active in any field than to be thinking about what would be the best way, or be I see nowadays in some people or some people from universities having a lot of doubts. But if you throw yourself also in the water, you will learn. And what you told me in front of before our conversation is that you always had times or have times where you work very, very much, and being on one topic with a lot of energy helps you for other topics as well.
Go for Leadership, the podcast with Daniel and Gert.
I absolutely agree, and I think that's a great way also answering that question. So thank you so much, Anselm, for being our guest today. It was a pleasure.
Daniel, thank you as well. It was a pleasure.
Go for Leadership, the podcast.